everything through. I'm just going to turn down the volume and just a little bit just to prevent the clipping. Okay. So yeah, sorry about the delay, everyone. Thanks, we were able to get everything up and running and working. Knock on wood. So okay. Thank you for coming on today. I think one of the things that I've been really wanting to do, as we've talked about, is start to expand the conversations of the Power Platform out a little bit more broadly, outside of just Power BI. And you guys were both recommended to me within the MVP community and everything related to that. So I'm really excited to get both of you on to talk about some things related to Azure and Synapse and other cool components of the Microsoft platform that can connect and play nicely with Power BI, and certainly in terms of both what can be exported and then also imported into data sets and models and everything else. So I'm very excited to be able to be the fly on the wall today and learn about some additional stuff. I'm pretty familiar with Synapse from a broad perspective, but definitely are nowhere near as hands-on as you two are. But given that context and everything else, do you two want to give a little introduction about yourselves?
Sure. Sure. So my name is Justin Moen. I'm the Director of Data Engineering here at Xeris, and we're located here in West Des Moines, Iowa. And we spent some time over the last couple of years just really learning about Synapse as a new product. We had a little bit of experience with some Data Factory and some of the other tools that were out there in the Microsoft stack. But once Synapse was introduced, we felt that was a real cool tool that can definitely improve the data landscape for companies and some of our clients.
Excellent, thank you.
And I'm Eric Gleiter. I'm a data engineer here at Xeris. I think Justin really hit the nail on the head there. We think Synapse came out, and we thought it was a pretty cool tool. We've kind of focused on understanding it as much as we can, as it's been all the updates have been rolling out and changes have been happening.
And I love the amount of AI and machine learning driven stuff that Microsoft's continually leaning into, where they're sprinkling so many different products with automated processes for a lot of these things, especially in the Azure platform. So like I said, I'm very excited to just see some of the conversations around this today, especially in terms of the BI integrations as well.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent, yeah. And I think today what we want to help talk about is like I said, the introduction to Synapse. There's a lot, as you'll notice what's out there. You can go a lot deeper into what we're talking about today, but we just want to, basically, it's more of an awareness of what the tool that's out there. Over the years, we'll talk about a little bit in the presentation. It's more of an a la carte. If you wanted to do, a data lake, or you want to do a data warehouse, you'd have to go, get the tools individually from Microsoft. Synapse helps bring all those tools together into one spot, into one platform, one studio, from a development perspective. So it really helps to tightly integrate their products together.
Yep. And like Justin said, the goal of the day is the introduction. We want you to leave here knowing, understanding what Synapse is and maybe a little bit of how some of the components work together.
Yeah, it's like Matthias is in the chat. What's everything about Synapse? What's the conversation? So a good introduction, I think, will be great. You are the first two who will be on the channel as well to be able to walk through that. So this will be, I think, a nice introduction for both the audience who's tuning in today, but then people who will be watching this recording moving forward as well.
Excellent.
All right.
I can flip over to the slide if you want.
Sure. Yeah, let's jump into it.
Perfect. I'm all over. Yep.
Okay. Well, as we've introduced ourselves, like I said, I'm Justin Moen, and I'm the Director of Data Engineering here at Xeris in West Des Moines. Like I said, we're located in Iowa, and Eric Gleiter, a data engineer here at Xeris. And as we kind of talked about, what we're trying to do here is we want to provide you with an introduction to what Synapse is, how to plan for a successful implementation into Synapse, and how to effectively execute on the implementation by utilizing the Azure Data Lake Gen2, pipelines and data flows, SQL pools, and some of the other Synapse components that are out there. Before we get into that, we kind of want to talk a little bit about data. And as companies have discovered, data projects are really hard. Data projects can be overwhelming, and especially as to where even to start. According to a study by Accenture, only about 32% are able to realize tangible and measurable value from data. And only about 27% said their data and analytics projects produced insights that are highly actionable. So with so much of a push to be data-driven, why are the results of these efforts so discouraging? You can't overlook the importance of a proper data foundation when you embark on an analytics journey. We've talked to many different organizations who want to know more about machine learning, AI, and advanced analytics, but when we get down to defining how to even start those projects, their current data infrastructure and processes are causing enough havoc when even trying to do some basic reporting. So what we're here to help you with is try to provide a proper data environment that will help you set up to do the basics well and open doors to advance into more complex analytics, when the time is right. So before we dive into Synapse and what Synapse is and how Synapse can help, we want to talk about some of the some of the components that go into a proper data foundation. Here's a prediction from 2019. And even though we're in 2022 and almost all the way through 2022, the components that are mentioned here are still ring true to set up that solid data foundation. So this quote said, by 2021, enterprises using a cohesive strategy to incorporate data hubs, lakes, and warehouses will support 30% more use cases than their competitors. It's important to know that not all data is created equal. It isn't all used for the same purpose, and the users who need this data varies as well. You can also see that the format that it's in and the frequency that you receive your data will vary greatly as well. At Xeris here, we like to say placing your data use cases into appropriate quadrants helps you understand the data requirements to help you achieve success. So the first thing we have to understand of the data is whether it's known or unknown. Known data means purposed, structured, defined. And unknown data is, maybe semi or unstructured data. Then we need to ask ourselves the questions. Are the questions that we need to ask of the data known or unknown? Known questions means well-defined and specific with ways to measure success or failure of the data. Unknown questions are more exploratory in nature, or hunches you may have, or something you're curious about within your data. Historically, relational data stores could only really store known data well, and you could use it to report off your well-known questions. This is your traditional data warehouse as we've kind of known it historically. This is where the incorporation of a data lake, we see organizations are able to support 30% more use cases. We can now store data before it fits into a defined relational schema, and we can explore the data even if we don't have really well-defined questions yet, or data that's in that unknown structure. So now you've heard a little bit about the data quadrants. Let's talk about why we're all here today, and that's to hear a little bit about Synapse. Historically, hybrid means a lot of different tools and potentially across many different platforms and vendors. Up until recently, those who standardized on the Azure cloud would have to use a lot of different products to achieve both relational data stores and reliable reporting and data lake for flexible storage, exploration, and big data analytics. This is what has made Synapse unique. This one platform is both relational and unstructured data storage, tooling for a modern a complex ELT system, direct integrations for reporting and analytics, all with low or to no code interfaces, query and syntax that users are already familiar with. Synapse brings a hybrid approach of a data lake plus data warehousing into one place, which makes it easy for to manage and adopt within your organization. But here's a little bit of an overview of kind of the Azure Synapse environment. When working with Synapse, users will access the Azure Synapse Studio from within the Azure environment. The Azure Synapse Studio is a unified environment for data integration, data management, monitoring, and security. It can connect to many different data sources, whether they be in the cloud, on-prem, and we'll talk a little bit more in this presentation of how to connect to these different data sources. So to get into a little bit of the tools that are within the Azure Synapse environment, you can see we'll start at the bottom with the Azure Data Lake Gen2, and this is where we store the data. This can be in many different formats, such as a CSV file and Parquet, just to name a few. The storing data in a data lake is cost effective as blob storage is relatively cheap compared to on-prem storage. we've heard, talk to many customers who have been on an on-prem model and talking about the cloud model, and some of these clients have said that storing data is expensive, and what they don't realize is how cheap it can be actually within the cloud. The next component we want to talk about is the data integration component, and this is composed of the Synapse pipelines and data flows, which are used to copying data and for data orchestration. If you're familiar with Data Factory, this is a component of what has been called Data Factory as kind of the standalone tool. Next, the Manage Hub component is used to manage data connections to different sources and targets, schedule and trigger pipelines to run, monitor resource usage, and set security all in one location. The next part we're going to talk about is the SQL pools, which there are two types. There's serverless and dedicated SQL pools, and Eric will talk a little bit more about these later in this presentation. Synapse also supports Apache Spark, which is a parallel processing framework that supports in-memory processing to boost the performance of big data analytic applications. Apache Spark notebooks support multiple programming languages such as T-SQL, KSQL, KQL, or Custo, Python, Scala, Spark, SQL, and .NET. In addition to the components contained within Azure Synapse, there are other tools that are tightly integrated and tools that I'm sure you're familiar with, such as the Azure Machine Learning, Power BI, and a relatively new tool called Azure Purview. And this is a unified data governance solution that can manage metadata from multiple data sources, identify and monitor sensitive data, and help understand your data lineage. This is, like I said, this is a relatively new tool that became generally available on September 28th, 2021. So it's definitely still in its infancy stages, and I'm sure this is a tool that Microsoft will continue to improve on in the years to come. So how do you start? There's two angles to think about when you start a project like this. It's the conceptual strategy and the tactical execution. Both are extremely important, and we're going to try in our very limited time today to give some helpful hints on how to get started on with both. We want you to leave today with a solid understanding of what Synapse is, how it lays a great foundation for businesses who are trying to prepare themselves for analytics. We want you to feel like you have an understanding of how to practically get started, see our process for doing the necessary preparation for success, as well as understanding the tactical and technical components that go into setting up an environment and starting to bring data into this environment. So at Xeris, we feel like this is one of our specialty and one thing that we hopefully do pretty well for our clients. As you know, data is always a moving target, and it always is going to be that way. You never know. You're never going to get back to a place with any data environment. You can step back and say, we're done. That's what we specialize in, working with your team to set up the strategy and get your results done fast. And it's amazing how quickly the execution can come in, which is step 5, can come together if we work through steps 1 through 4 very well. We have processes that make this really successful. So typically the first project to lay the foundation for this environment will continue to expand. And we feel it usually takes 12 to 24 weeks to complete. So, based on our feedback from the customers, this is much faster than customers tell us they could have done this on their own. But once we get to step 5, how do you actually start working with Synapse? Now, once again, it's much less overwhelming if you have a clear target of what you're shooting at. But let's take a look at how the tool is set up and some of the key pieces you need within your environment. So again, to get started on the tactical design, we typically define our data into 5 different zones, and each zone is decoupled from the previous zone. And by doing this can help prevent your data lake from becoming that dreaded data swamp. And again, these zones that we'll talk about here in a minute are zones that we've typically done with customers, but every project and every company is going to be slightly different. So this is kind of a general set of zones that we typically try to use. So the first thing we're going to start with is our raw zone. And again, this is all within the data lake at this point. So the raw zone contains copies of our data from our data sources. The data in here should be direct copies of the data and the data sources, and in most cases, not contain any changes or transformations to the data. And again, as Eric will talk about in a little bit, we've used Synapse to connect to data sources and bring our data into our raw zone. The next zone is our transformation zone. This is where we begin to alter the data from the original structure, forming actions such as replacing null strings with spaces, null numeric values with 0, adding derived columns, renaming columns to a common naming convention, and other actions. Unless needed for business logic, we typically don't combine data from multiple data sources at this time. But again, that's a general rule of thumb. But there's times that we will, definitely do this as well. The next zone we have is we call it the curated zone, and this is with data from all of our sources, and now into a more standardized format. This is the zone where we can combine combine and join data from multiple data sources into our curated zone. And again, like I mentioned, these first the first 3 stages here, we perform our actions within the data lake. So we'll do a lot of the joins if we can, and we'll store that data in the data lake. As we've talked about, that the storage in the data lake is much cheaper, than it used to be. So we're not worried about a storage cost. The last piece we're going to talk about here is the relational data store. And as you've noticed, up until this point, the data has been stored in the data lake. So now we're moving that data from the curated zone in the data lake into a dedicated SQL pool. And this is the SQL pool is where we use tools such as Power BI, that these will connect to the SQL pool, and this will be in an environment that's the format that is optimized for reporting and for analytics. So with the different zones, our data is now organized as each zone serves a purpose, whether you have users that want to report from the relational data store, SQL pool, or have data scientists who are curious as to what data is available and could potentially be the source for the next big discovery for the business. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who will talk you through what the data lake looks like in Azure and other Synapse components.
Yep. So Justin was talking a lot about the whys of Azure Synapse. Why do we do this? Why do we do that? I'm going to be talking more about the hows. And the first question you might have is, how are we going to be storing all of that data that we just brought into the cloud in our different zones? And that's going to be with Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. This was built on top of blob storage with the added benefit of having a hierarchical namespace. So, for example, each of those different zones that we talked about will just be a different folder in your data lake. So we'll have, the raw folder, or as some people call them, bronze, silver, gold. Lots of different namings, as the chat is saying. Naming is definitely one of the hardest things to do. But we're going to be naming the folders after our different zones. So raw, transform, curated, and then we can further subdivide those as well down to, data source, type, maybe the date you're ingesting the data, all the different types of things. Once we have our data stored, the next question would be, how are we going to be manage credentials for all those different data sources and connections? Justin, can you go to the next slide? And that's going to be with Azure Key Vault. That's going to be where we keep all of our credentials. Key Vault is not directly a part of Synapse, but it is a tool that is tightly integrated with Synapse. So anywhere inside of Synapse that you would see the option to have a password, encrypted key, or certificate, you can enter that in using Key Vault instead. And the main benefit of using Key Vault alongside Azure Synapse would be to allow you to not only not have to be distributing passwords around your environment, but also you can rotate your credentials. So on monthly, weekly, daily basis, and not have to worry about breaking any access during any of your ETL processes. Everything will just be automatically updated using Key Vault. After storage and credentials, the next question is, how are we connecting to our different data sources? And with that, there's 3 parts of that all go into connecting to your data sources. The first is link services. The easiest way to think about what a link service is just simply a connection string. So that works with a ton of out-of-the-box connectors. One you don't see up here, but is definitely one that people take advantage of, is the Power BI connector. But like I said, the main way to think about what a link service is just a connection string that allows you to connect to a data source. Following that up, we have integration runtimes. This is where the compute happens. So any transformations or any activities will be going through integration runtime. So there's two different types. The first is a self-hosted integration runtime where you pay for all the resources, but then you don't pay for any compute. And some of the benefits of that are it being more in your control. There's not other people, like there's no queue. It's just you're the only one using it. It's easier to lock down and limit points of access in your network. But some of the drawbacks are the drawbacks of on-premise work in general, which is there's no scalability. You have to have as much compute as you're ever going to need unless you want to buy more in the future. And with that comes the other type of integration runtime, which is an Azure hosted integration runtime. This is hosted in the cloud and allows you to do the pay-as-you-go model where you can scale up or down based on your different needs. And then lastly, for connecting to our data, we have data sets. The way I like to think about what a data set is it's an abstract representation of your data. This is how Synapse is going to be actually interacting with your data in any way. So this could be, for example, a Parquet file in the data lake. It could be a folder full of files. It could be a table in a SQL Server somewhere. It can be lots of different things, but they're all interacting through data sets. The main benefit of using data sets inside of Synapse is that it allows your pipelines and data flows, which I'll touch on in just a second, to understand the schema of your data ahead of time so that you can work with exactly what this particular data is going to look like in your data flows without having to load anything into memory or do anything in terms of getting that data ready. You just have a representation of where your data lives and what it looks like ready to go while you're working inside of Synapse. So a little bit of a recap of where we're at so far. We've talked about how we're storing our data inside of Synapse, how we're connecting to that data, and how we're storing credentials. Now we're going to get into the real fun part, the real meat and potatoes of what's going on here. And to start with that, we're going to talk about Synapse pipelines. Pipelines are very similar to Data Factory pipelines. If you've ever worked with Data Factory at all, it's not quite one-to-one, but if you've done work in Data Factory, you could get going into pipelines pretty easily. This is the main method for all data orchestration and movement inside of Synapse and utilizes a drag and drop, low-code interface. What pipelines actually are, though, is they're just groupings of different activities. So these activities can be data transformation, they can be copying data around, setting variables, calling machine learning algorithms. They can be lots of different things, but they all usually are interacting with those data sets that I talked about just a minute ago. So you can call your pipeline that has these activities. These activities interact with data sets. An example of what that looks like can be found on this next slide. That will be, here's a pipeline that has 3 activities inside of it. We have a lookup activity to grab some information, performing a for each activity to grab every table in that operation, and then we're executing another pipeline. And you might wonder, well, why am I executing another pipeline? Why am I not just doing whatever that's doing here in this one pipeline? And there's 2 reasons for that. One is a technical reason, that being that there's just a limit on the number of activities that you can have inside any given pipeline, which is forces you to have to break things out into other pipelines. But the other, in my opinion, vastly more important reason is the principle of separating logical groups of code. So similarly, in development, you wouldn't want to just rewrite code all over the time. In Synapse, you don't want to be redoing the same activities over and over. So an example of what that could look like is if you had a logging activity, rather than having a logging pipeline, rather than having the same 3 or 4 activities inside every pipeline you make, you can create one pipeline called logging and just drop that into every pipeline that you need it in. And that way, if you have to make changes in the future, you just make changes to one pipeline and it's changed everywhere, as opposed to having to change each individual pipeline. Next up, we're going to talk about what I think are probably the most important activities to understand, and those are the data transformation activities. We're going to talk today about data flows and notebooks, but you can also use stored procedures for SQL servers, but I figure most people, they know what those are, and they're not quite as central to what Synapse is as data flows and notebooks. So what are data flows and notebooks? Data flows are a data transformation tool. It's more visual in nature. It's the no low-code option for doing transformations. Usually you'll use these for the more simple operations, cleaning data up, adding some simple calculated columns, creating some simple visual columns. Whereas notebooks, these are more code-based. They're highly flexible, but they're more used for more complex operations, such as machine learning operations or anything where you need to do something more complex and that can be handled in just a simple visual format. Now, I'd be remiss if I talked about how visual data flows were and then didn't show you what one of those looked like. So on the next slide here, we have an example of a data flow. And as you get experienced inside of working with Synapse, you can understand what's happening here just kind of at a glance. You can see we're bringing in 3 sources, doing 2 joins, doing some cleanup column activities, and then syncing those data sets off somewhere else. And then if we zoom in on one of those activities, one of those join activities, we can see some of the different options we have there. So we'll zoom in on one of those joins on the next slide and see that you can see all the different settings that you have, and that really truly is really low code. You're just kind of picking every option that you need and setting it up. And some of you might be asking, how do I know, since I'm doing this all with just configuration, how do I know what I'm doing is correct? And I want to bring your attention to that data preview button. So for every activity inside of a data flow, you can preview what that data is going to look like at any moment in time. Which is an extremely useful feature for like debugging purposes or making sure that you're doing the correct transformation. And the reason I'm showing you the button and not like the output table itself is because 1, I don't think anyone wants to look at a bunch of obfuscated data in a table. And 2 is because I also wanted to draw your attention to a feature of Synapse that I think is pretty underrated, and that's the Learn More button that's linked everywhere throughout the tool. In most places in the tool, there's that Learn More button that links directly to documentation about what you're working on. It's really helpful for new users getting up to speed, and it can help experienced users debug quicker if they need to check out, oh, did something change in this activity? Let me look at the documentation and make sure I did everything correctly. Lastly, in our overview of Synapse and how to work inside of Synapse, we're going to talk about SQL pools, which is the ultimate destination for your data most times. There's 2 different types of SQL pools, one of them being serverless SQL pools. This is for data that doesn't need to be persistent. So one example that might be helpful for you guys in the Power BI community is if you're just going to import your data into Power BI, once you've done all the necessary transformations, brought all your data together, and you have it in that last curated zone that we talked about later, you could use a serverless SQL pool to do your loading of your data into Power BI, and then do that on like a daily or weekly basis and not have to worry about storing the data in a dedicated SQL pool. Like I said, this is not for non-persistent data, so there won't be any data stored. Oh, I thought I was going to sneeze there. But you will be paying for the compute used to process the queries. On the other hand, we have dedicated SQL pools. These were formerly known as SQL Data Warehouse inside of Azure. They're similar to, they are a relational database store. So you have all the same features that you would have inside of a serverless SQL pool, such as doing queries, running SQL queries, having access to connections. But in this case, you're also being able to store the data. So if you want to connect to a different reporting or dashboarding system that doesn't import data on its own, you can store it in a dedicated SQL pool so that you're ready to go. And additionally, there have been some optimizations inside of dedicated SQL pools for big data queries and improving massive query performance for Power BI specifically, just as I know the audience here likes that. And there's been some other performance improvements as well for storage. After that, we've talked a little bit about everything to do with Synapse. Is there maybe any questions for either the 2 of us?
Yeah, so I did have one from Matthias that I'll bring up. And just to add on to all the fun tech issues that I was mentioning earlier, so yeah, I can't put the YouTube comments on the screen, but I will read them off. So Matthias was asking, what is the need for Synapse versus say like just stay in Power BI for data processing and development? Because data flows, as an example, I think to elaborate on that is something that can also be built out in Power BI as well.
Yep. So there'd be one of the main reasons I would say is, well, there's 2 reasons. One of them more technical, one of them more philosophical. The more technical reason would be performance. So Synapse has some performance increases that might not be captured over in Power BI. And especially working with extremely large data sets. Yep. Synapse is built to handle everything from small data sets up to massive terabytes worth of data. So performance benefits can be kept there. And then the more philosophical one is you might have more teams than just like a Power BI team working inside of Synapse, so that Power BI might not be the only thing that you're doing for this data. You could have a data scientist working on doing just some experimental stuff. You could have machine learning things going on in here as well. It wouldn't be just like a one-stop shop for dashboarding and visuals. It could be used for that in addition to a bunch of other activities the business might be doing.
And I think to paraphrase what you just said at the end, one is the biggest thing kind of is where else is the data going to be used? And data flows is just one example of some of the data processing, but how many different places it's being used. And I probably should know this, but I know that data flows in Power BI can be placed into the Gen 2 storage. I can't recall if that's out of preview yet. I know it was added somewhat recently, in the Power BI's pipeline, but its ability to go to other sources is still on a grow up story. Whereas you mentioned Azure kind of just, it's so much easier to consume and to use the data in a lot of other spots to consume larger data, and then also to have the more like ML and data science type stuff, which is definitely where you want, Azure's where you want to be doing more of those really advanced computational scenarios and everything else.
Yep.
Yeah, I think real quick to expand on that, we talked about, I don't know, I kind of live by a motto: just because you can doesn't mean you should mentality. And Power BI, allows you to do a lot of the things you talked about, a lot of the modeling and whatnot. You can build derived columns, you can build whatever you want to at a report level. You can do it within Power BI, the modeling feature as well. But I try to tend to push my logic as far left as possible, where it's going to be where I think it might be reused. So, and that's where we talk about that transformation layer. So if you've got logic that's going to be reused over and over from many different companies, kind of like you said, whether it's machine learning, whether it's Power BI reports, we try to do some of that logic in the transformation layer and serve it up in the relational data store. Whereas you could do that as well in Power BI, but if it's going to be reused, try to push that logic as left as possible.
Exactly. And I mean, Microsoft likes the term data siloing, in the sense that you want as little of that as possible. Anytime you can have a source that can be used in as many locations without having people needing to duplicate that data for their own use because they can't easily connect to it, like that's in a sense it's empowerment and working towards that self-service, whether or not it's from the back end database scenario or even in BI. Like the goal is to have as few artifacts in your tenant when it comes to unique data sources and transformations as possible.
Yes.
Yep.
And real quick, one of the other reasons we've seen it used is from a security perspective of you might have the available field in a data set, but you don't want to give that whole data set available to all the end users. So you might servo that up into a smaller data set that can be connected in Power BI and consumed from there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And I noticed another question in chat that I think is right up Justin's alley. Is this tool similar to Alteryx?
Yes, I've used Alteryx quite a bit. There's definitely a lot of similarities. I've seen some clients that have actually said, okay, we're going to try to get rid of Alteryx and go to Data Factory. Personally, I feel depending on what you're trying to do, if you're trying to use it as a data analytics tool to try to figure out, do some data manipulations, Synapse pipelines and data flows probably, I would tend to say Alteryx is probably better for that. If you're trying to move data around the Azure environment, I would definitely probably say Azure pipelines is better. One thing about Alteryx, I know they've got some in database features, but a lot of, from my experience, it's been you pull it from the source, it brings it back to your local computer and pushes it back to a source. So you're moving it from basically cloud to on-prem to cloud. And so there's some performance gains that can be used by doing this within Synapse.
And I would say a better analogy too for Alteryx is like Synapse does do some of that, but in terms of the interface and everything else, I consider Power Query more of the equivalent of that in a large sense. And that is something that I would say, like, what I've seen with Microsoft is they're essentially slowly turning that into just their de facto transformation tool in almost any system. Azure has it in multiple locations now, like everywhere. Power BI, of course, even Power Apps has that built in. Power Query Online is basically just being placed everywhere to, like, essentially if you have data that needs to go to one of our data storage locations in the Microsoft platform, we will give you this tool to, do the clicky, draggy, droppy, as Christian Wade says, and just be able to transform the data, throw it in, and put it into there. So to me, that's what I usually get people comparing the two, Alteryx versus that. And Alteryx does have a few extra bells and whistles, but it also 10, 15 times the cost of often what that is. So like the only times that I see people usually using that versus the other is when they're enterprise, they're dealing with terabytes of data. They have very specific, highly advanced transformations that they need to do that like is so nuanced that they have to go for some other tool. But otherwise, 99% of the time, Power Query or Synapse or anything in between, or Power Query in data flows inside of Synapse. Gotta love all the different terms for Microsoft. Works beautifully for most data scenarios. Excellent. All right. I think that was it for the questions for the moment. We have one other. I don't know if you wanted to address that now or later. Besides
Go ahead
Power
and do
BI
it
and
now.
machine learning, what other use cases could Synapse be used for? And maybe that's something you'll be getting into.
Um, I mean, if you want to go first, Justin, I can take this one.
Sure. I think one of the biggest things where we feel it's the use is transforming or querying large amounts of data. One of the things that you can do with Synapse is you can throw more resources at it. So if it's in the cloud, it's called DW units. And I've had a client that's you can set the DW units. It's obviously where that's set is what you pay for. And so if you have a DW unit set at 200 or 300 or whatever that number is, that might be good enough for 95% of your queries and your users that are trying to query your data. You may have to do some large processing, and you can up that DW units on your environment to call it 2,000 or 3,000, whatever that is, to process your large amounts of data, and then scale it right back down, when you need it. So basically, you can pay for the processing when you need it, the power when you need it, and scale it right back down when you don't.
Yep. And then another use case I'm going to jump in here and add on is a lot of times when we're working with clients, we're deciding what to call the project. We end up calling it Data Foundation because Synapse really helps you lay a solid foundation for your data. So regardless of the endpoint, if it's going to be ML, reporting, dashboarding, or some other use case, really the goal is to build a sustainable environment that can be used for a wide variety of things. So whether that's, we're building a tool that ultimately will be for reporting, or we're building a tool that is just getting all of those different data silos, bringing them all into one place that we can now start exploring truly what the organization's data can offer and see and explore more of how they can put it to better use and get more value out of it.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And like I mentioned in the chat as well, if there's any remaining questions, also don't forget to add a queue just to make sure that I can capture those. But otherwise, no, I think this is fantastic. I like the broad overview that helps not only show the use cases for this and integrations, whether they're part of the Azure platform, but also the, I think just in Microsoft in general, between Azure and Power Query, the number of connectors I think are nearly industry leading, if not industry leading, in terms of the ability to pull in from a lot of different sources and easily get that data in to do any kind of processing that's needed, but also then quickly and easily export that to various other portions within Azure, outside of Azure, within Power BI, or even in other platforms as well if people are using other tools or other SaaS services to be able to then do advanced analytics on the data. The one thing that slightly outside of the, speaking of connectors and outside of Synapse, is I found it interesting that the first release of Purview, which is for people who can, enterprise who can afford it, is a great way for auto documenting and security and everything else. But I found it interesting that the V1 did not have a built-in dynamic CRM connector. I thought that was kind of funny. That's something that you had to build a custom connector for, like, Microsoft, it's your own platform. That should have been a day one add-on. You should not have to write a custom connector for probably the most common source for like CRM type data kept in Power BI. But I thought that was an interesting launch with that quirk.
Yeah, we've been looking at the tool for the last year as well, and I found that it was constantly changing.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, the other
Yeah,
tool.
good.
Yeah, another example of that kind of like a day one quirkiness was just when they introduced data policy, which is going to be their attempt for data access governance into Purview. The first feature was you can't disallow anything. You can only do allows. So it's like, come on,
Yeah.
guys. This allows going to be on like the number one.
The things that I think come to realize is Microsoft's good at making an announcement for a product like, oh yeah, this is the best thing since sliced bread, and sometimes it is, sometimes not. But the ones that I've noticed that usually when they say it day one, it's going to be that in like 12 months. Another great example is data lakes, and it's such a commonly used term, but now there's an official data lake inside of Power BI. The V1 launch of that, especially with the fact that SSMS cannot write back to it, it can only read from there. It's not a true database yet. As soon as they add a few other features to make it like, I like to refer to it as almost baby's first, data database. For SMB, I think there's a huge value to have that. You click a button, you spin up a database, you take all your data from flat files, and you actually have a relational database now in the service with read-write capabilities. So in another 6 to 12 months, I think it will be an amazing feature, but it still had that grow up. So Purview, I think, it's continued to evolve and getting a lot better. But there's definitely a lot of releases that I see where it's 80% of what I want, but there's still those few features that are preventing me from truly recommending it as a de facto tool for clients. And that usually comes about 12 to 16 months after the initial release of the product. Yeah. I had a question, another one from Matthias. Churn rate for Azure Synapse so far, if you understand that one.
Churn rate, is that referring
Yeah.
to like quick Google says the rate at which customers stop doing business with the company over a given period of time. So
I'm wondering, is this like, are you asking, is there a churn rate of people who like kind of buy and then cancel? Like, so let's say they're at, Synapse subscription or uses for that. Or maybe if you just want to type a follow-up to that to elaborate a little bit. Okay, yeah, that is
Yep.
what he was going for.
Yep. So with the clients we've worked with, the vast majority of them are still using Synapse. I think anyone that has committed to a project that already has some value to it. So, for example, we had one that was reducing data silos, bringing things together, and then reporting off of that combined data. Anything that they have a clear goal in mind, they're still using Synapse, and they haven't seen any sort of desire to move to a different platform. The only time we've seen clients really not buy in is when there wasn't a ton of buy-in in the initial process. So like it could have been any cloud tool or any data software. They might have just given up and gone back to their own in-house ways. And even in those cases, they're still on the table. They're still pushing for more. I think as long as the clients have bought in, I don't see many of them moving away from Synapse since it's so tightly integrated with all of Microsoft's other offerings, and allows you to just set up a good foundation for everything. That it's more of a, once they're in, and if they dip their toe in, it's really, it's either you're in or out, and once you're in, you just kind of stay in.
And
hopefully that answered that question for you.
To follow up on that, we haven't had anybody that's gone to Synapse and done an implementation and backed out and gone somewhere else at this point.
Excellent. Yep. Like you said, the amount of investment that usually goes into, because there's definitely with any Azure competitors, there's a decent upfront cost that people usually don't flip a switch and like, let's just try this out and spend a lot of money on a whim. Similar with machine learning, by the time I've seen that get implemented, more often than not with my clients, it usually is implemented fairly well and had a long project scoping to make sure that it will be done well, because there's a large cash value that's being assigned to spending onto that versus, oh, let's just try Power BI. We throw in 10 pro licenses. It's $100 a month.
But one of the things we have seen though is we've had a couple customers, and you can do this with the cost model of we don't know exactly how it's going to work, right? They're kind of reluctant to go to the cloud, or they're reluctant to go to an environment like this. And being that's a pay-as-you-go model, you can get into it relatively cheap. So we've done a couple of proof of concepts where we said, okay, we'll take a little bit of your data and show you how it works. and we can set up that initial data lake, that initial Synapse environment, and get it to a point where you can, connect Power BI and do some reporting. And some of those, we've worked on a couple of those projects and had, the customers have seen that as a success and continued on. So that's kind of, we've laid the foundation. I don't want to call it a proof of concept because it's not a proof of concept. When we do this, we usually do it at a point where you can continue to build on it and not have to start over.
Exactly. Perfect. If there's any other questions, feel free to drop them in now. Otherwise, I think we can start wrapping up. But no, this has been fantastic today. I think both from a, like I mentioned, presentation perspective, I learned quite a bit. And we do have one more. For sake of not butchering your name, I will not try to pronounce it, but otherwise, thank you for the question. I don't have a large data set, but I want to learn Synapse. How do I go about it, and how much might the usage credit cost me?
Yep. So going about learning Synapse can be done in a few different ways. The usage credit cost will really depend on how many different of the tools you want to learn at one time. So if you're just kind of playing around with pipelines and whatnot, it's pay as you go. I would say in our internal environment, we don't usually work with a ton of large data sets, and typically we don't spend more than maybe $100-$150 a month on everything. And we're doing more, like I said, we're doing relatively small operations, and we're not using a ton of different information. In terms of information on where to go, I would say there's lots of good YouTube tutorials out there for how to do X in Synapse, or just the documentation itself, like I mentioned in the presentation, is usually pretty good about explaining and maybe giving a use case or two on how to use an activity.
Excellent. Yeah, and if you have any links as well, let me know, and I can also make sure to update the description for any additional resource links that might not already be in there.
Yep.
I believe Microsoft gives some credits too for new users to do a little bit of, X number of dollars of credits. And you can set up some alerts. So if you get to a point where you're getting too much, or you want to set a $100 budget of $100, or something minimal, whatever you want, so you're alerted as you're approaching that.
Yep, that budget is the only reason I was able to pull a number out of my head at all, because I was like, oh yeah, I got the email yesterday that we crossed the threshold. So
alerts are good. You don't want to be that IT person who accidentally forgets to turn something back off, and then, why did we just spend $25,000 last month on a P5 node of this thing?
Yep. I will say on that note, the first pipeline I would recommend you learn how to do is a automatic SQL pool shutdown pipeline. It is easy to forget to turn off a dedicated SQL pool, and those you pay for any time they're online for the active storage.
That's okay. That's nice at least. So there's a way to monitor that, and I have seen times where those things have been reversed. Like somebody turns on, an IT person who forgot to turn something off, and then they can also see that 0 activity was done on this thing in like 30 days. Like, all right, well, like one time exception, we'll credit this back, but like do not ever do this again. Let's see. Yeah, I'm looking at the last question. I think you're reading that too. Looking about, it would be great to have a walkthrough or possibly hands-on session of how to pull data using Synapse pipeline, then over to an ADLS, then into SQL dedicated pool. Okay, yeah. So more of like a deeper dive on the how rather than the why, which the goal of this was more of the whys and a broad overview of the platform rather than a deep dive tech demo. But and I'll let you two respond in just a sec, but I'll just mention from a channel perspective, my goal, I think over the next 6 to 12 months, now that I've covered a lot of Power BIs, I do want to continue to have more sessions on Azure, Synapse, Power Apps, Pages, everything else. So either from you two, Justin and Eric, or anybody else, I'd love to continue to have people back on to do some of these types of things and have walkthroughs and demos and tutorials.
Yep. I know personally I'd be fine to come back on and do that kind of session like that, or if he has plans for other people to do that, that's fine as well. Also, feel free to reach out to either of us. I think our emails were on the screen in the last presentation, just our names at xeris.com, or feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn either.
Yep. All your extra details are below in the video description.
Yeah, like I said, if you want to have us back on to do that, I'd be fine doing that.
Excellent. Yeah, I always love to have presenters back on, so that would be fantastic sometime in the future.
Excellent.
Okay. I think we're at about the hour, so we can use that to wrap up. But yeah, thanks both of you for coming on and presenting today. This has been fantastic, and like I said, I'd love to have you back on sometime in the future.
Awesome. Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Have a good day,
yeah.
everyone.
Take care, and everybody have a great weekend.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much for watching. Please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you want to help support this channel, take a look at our channel memberships or our merchandise store for cool swag. And last but not least, please consider sharing this video on your social media platform of choice to help our channel grow. So, until next time.